Good evening. Tonight, a question nobody asked but everyone should fear the answer to: what exactly filled the stomachs of ordinary people in Tudor England, and how much of it was technically edible? If you haven't already, consider subscribing to Planet Shmearth for more stories that will ruin your appetite and improve your sleep. And wherever you're listening, whether it's late evening or the deep hours past midnight, you're in the right place. Picture gentle rain falling somewhere outside, steady and soft, asking nothing of you. Breathe in slowly. The rain continues, quiet and patient. It will fall whether you listen or not. Breathe out. Let the day fall away. Now we begin. You wake in near darkness, the thatch overhead sagging with damp and the smell of yesterday's smoke still trapped in the rafters. The fire pit in the center of the room holds grey coals. Your hands are stiff from cold. You rise from the straw pallet, step over your younger brother, and reach for the wooden bowl near the hearth. It is morning, and morning means one thing: pottage. The pot hangs over the fire, blackened from years of use, half full of yesterday's grain sludge. You ladle a portion into your bowl. It is thick, greyish, studded with fragments of barley and split peas. There is no spoon. You drink it, tepid and gritty, tasting of ash and faint sourness. Your mother adds water from the pail to stretch what remains. She does not speak. You wipe your mouth on your sleeve and tear a hunk from the loaf of rye bread on the table. It is coarse, dense, flecked with bits of chaff and grit from the millstone. You chew slowly. The bread is your wage, your comfort, your plate, your future. 3 pounds of it, if you are lucky, will pass through you today. The reality of Tudor peasant diet was not one of variety or delight. It was a study in repetition, scarcity, and the constant grinding work of turning grain into something that could be swallowed. Bread, in its coarsest form, constituted the backbone of survival. Rye, barley, and maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, were ground into flour that bore little resemblance to the white, fine powder of later centuries. The milling process left behind fragments of husk and stone dust. Loaves were dense, dark, sour from natural fermentation, and baked in communal ovens or on hearthstones. A family might bake once a week, producing enough bread to last through the days ahead. By the third or fourth day, the loaves had hardened into something closer to wood than food. But this hardness had a purpose. Stale bread became trenchers, thick slices or hollowed rounds that served as edible plates. When a family managed to acquire a cut of salted pork or a bit of stewed mutton, the meat and its juices soaked into the trencher below. After the meal, the bread, now softened and flavored, was consumed or given to the dogs, or saved for the next day's pottage. Nothing was wasted. The logic was elegant in its brutality. Even your plate fed you. Pottage itself was the other pillar. A thick stew of grains, pulses, and whatever could be scavenged or grown. It simmered perpetually over the hearth. Barley, oats, peas, beans, and lentils formed the base. If the household kept a pig, a scrap of fat or a bone might be added for flavor. Onions and leeks, when available, provided sharpness. Herbs from the garden, parsley, thyme, added faint green notes. But fresh vegetables, those bright, crisp things we now consider virtuous, were viewed with suspicion. Medical theory of the time held that raw greens caused wind, sickness, and imbalance in the humors. Lettuce, cabbage, cucumbers, all were thought dangerous unless cooked into submission. Peasants ate their vegetables boiled, mashed, and rendered safe. Breathe slowly. Feel the weight of a long day pressing into your shoulders. The air is thick with the smell of old smoke and damp wool. Rest here. Meat, for most, was a rare blessing. Salted fish, herring in particular, appeared more often. Herring was cheap, abundant, and could be preserved for months. It was also aggressively salty, requiring soaking before it could be eaten. Even then, it tasted of brine and desperation. On holy days and feast days, fresh fish might be consumed, but for the majority of the calendar, salted herring was the closest thing to animal protein. Pork appeared occasionally, from the household pig slaughtered in autumn. Every part of the animal was used: blood for pudding, intestines for sausage casings, fat rendered into lard. Fresh pork lasted days. Salted and smoked, it stretched into winter. Dairy existed, though not in abundance. Milk soured quickly and was often made into cheese or butter. Cheese was hard, crumbly, and stored wrapped in cloth. Butter, precious and prone to rancidity, was used sparingly or sold. Eggs, when hens cooperated, provided a source of fat and protein. But hens were temperamental, and winter meant fewer eggs. Nothing could be counted on. And then there was ale. Water, drawn from rivers, wells, and communal sources, was unsafe. It carried disease, tasted foul, and was avoided when possible. Ale, on the other hand, was boiled during brewing, rendering it relatively safe. It was weak, murky, and drunk by everyone, including children. Small beer, the weakest variety, was consumed at breakfast, midday, and supper. Adults drank stronger ale. A household brewed its own, or bought from the local alewife, a woman licensed to sell her product. The brewing process was simple: malted barley, water, yeast, and thyme. The result was a sour, flat liquid that bore little resemblance to modern beer. But it was wet. It was safer than water, and it provided a few calories. Everyone drank it, all day, every day. Sugar, meanwhile, existed in a realm so distant from peasant life, it might as well have been alchemy. Imported from the Mediterranean and the New World, refined sugar was expensive beyond measure. The wealthy consumed it in grotesque quantities, sculpting it into elaborate confections called subtleties, or eating marchpane, a paste of almonds and sugar molded into shapes. Their teeth rotted spectacularly. The poor tasted sweetness perhaps twice a year, when honey could be bartered or stolen from a wild hive. Honey was precious, hoarded, used in tiny amounts to ease a cough or sweeten a medicinal brew. You stand in the garden behind the cottage, pulling turnips from the mud. They are small, misshapen, coated in soil that clings to your hands. You brush them against your tunic and drop them into the wicker basket. Turnips again, turnips boiled into pottage. Turnips mashed with a little lard if you are fortunate, turnips that taste of earth and nothing else. You pull another. The leaves are wilted, pale. You will chop them and add them to the pot tonight. Nothing is left behind. The pig watches from its pen, grunting. It eats better than you do. Acorns, kitchen scraps, the whey left from cheese making. In November, it will be slaughtered, and for a few weeks the house will smell of roasting pork. Until then, you eat turnips. The rhythm of the Tudor peasant diet followed the agricultural calendar with ruthless precision. Spring brought lean times. The previous year's grain stores dwindled. Bread became scarcer. Pottage thinned. Wild garlic, nettles, and sorrel were gathered from hedgerows and fields, boiled into soups that tasted green and bitter. These foraged foods were grudgingly accepted as famine insurance, not celebrated. Summer offered some relief. Peas and beans ripened. Soft fruits, strawberries, raspberries appeared briefly and were eaten immediately, rarely preserved. Autumn was the season of relative abundance. Grain was harvested, threshed, stored. Pigs were fattened. Apples were picked, some eaten fresh, most pressed into cider or dried for winter. Winter, predictably, was cruel. The The diet narrowed to its core components: bread, pottage, salted fish, dried peas, and ale. Fresh food vanished. Vegetables stored in root cellars grew soft and sprouted. Meat, already rare, became a memory. Hunger was not dramatic starvation, but a low, constant presence. Bellies were never quite full. Meals were smaller. Portions shrank. Children cried at night. By February, the weakest began to sicken. Illnesses that might have been shrugged off in summer became fatal. The old and the very young died quietly, blamed on cold humors or bad air. The economics of food were simple and unyielding. A peasant family, working a small plot of land, devoted the majority of their labor to grain. Wheat, when grown, was often sold or given as rent to the landlord. What remained was the coarser grains: barley, rye, oats. A household might produce enough to feed itself if the weather cooperated, if the harvest was not claimed by mildew or blight, if the rent was not too steep. Many did not produce enough. These families bought bread from bakers, paid in coin or labor, and lived perpetually on the edge of scarcity. The church's calendar imposed its own rhythms. Meat was forbidden on Fridays and during Lent, a period of roughly 40 days before Easter. For the wealthy, this meant imported salmon, pike, and trout. For peasants, it meant more herring. The restriction was taken seriously, enforced by social pressure and fear of sin. To eat meat on a forbidden day was to risk damnation. So the herring was soaked, boiled, and consumed without joy. The air is still now, thick with the faint staleness of unwashed wool and old straw. The day's work has left a dull ache in your limbs. Close your eyes, let the stillness hold you. Cooking methods were dictated by technology and fuel. The open hearth, a fire pit in the center of the room or built into a wall, provided heat and a place to suspend pots. Cauldrons hung from iron chains or tripods. Bread was baked on flat stones near the coals or taken to a communal oven. Roasting was rare, a technique reserved for festive occasions when a joint of meat could be skewered and turned over flames. Most food was boiled or stewed. Frying required fat, which was scarce and expensive. Ovens, when available, were shared by entire villages, and their use was rationed. Fuel itself was a concern. Wood was gathered from common lands, carefully managed to avoid depletion. Peat, dried and stacked, burned slowly and produced acrid smoke. Coal, in regions where it could be mined, was used sparingly. The fire was never allowed to die completely. To lose the coals meant starting over with flint and tinder, a tedious and uncertain process. The hearth was the heart of the home, literal and symbolic. It provided warmth, light, and the means to turn raw ingredients into something edible. Salting, smoking, and drying extended the life of meat and fish. Salt itself was expensive, mined from coastal flats or imported. It was used sparingly, measured, hoarded. Butter was salted and packed into barrels. Cheese, already a preservation method for milk, hardened and aged in cool larders. Vegetables were dried, pickled in brine, or stored in sand or straw. Apples were wrapped individually and kept in dark, cool spaces. Nothing lasted forever. Mold, rot, and vermin were constant enemies. Vermin were everywhere. Rats gnawed through grain sacks, mice nested in straw. Weevils infested flour. Flies settled on meat. There were no effective defenses. Cats were kept, but they could not patrol every corner. Food was eaten quickly. Before spoilage set in, moldy bread was scraped and consumed. Rancid fat was used in cooking. The margin between edible and inedible was thin and frequently crossed. The texture of daily eating was monotonous, coarse, and filled with small indignities. Grit from poorly milled flour wore down teeth. Bones in salted fish lodged in throat. Pottage, eaten day after day, became a flavorless necessity. There were no recipes, no written instructions. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to grandchild. You learned to judge doneness by smell and texture, to stretch ingredients, to salvage what seemed ruined. You sit at the long table in the manor hall, not as guest, but as laborer. It is harvest time, and the Lord has provided a meal for those who worked his fields. Before you sits a wooden trencher, and on it a piece of roasted pork, a rare sight. You do not reach for it immediately, you wait. The priest stands at the head of the table and speaks the blessing in Latin, words you do not understand. You bow your head. Around you 30 others do the same. The prayer ends. Only then do you pick up the meat with your fingers, tear at it, chew. The fat runs down your chin. You wipe it with the back of your hand and lick your fingers clean. Beside you, a man belches loudly. No one remarks on it. You drink from the shared cup of ale, pass it to your left, and reach for the bread. The rituals surrounding food were not optional. Every meal began with prayer, a brief acknowledgement of God's provision and a hedge against gluttony. Grace was said aloud in households that could afford candles for evening meals, muttered quietly by those eating in darkness. Food was a gift, however meager, and gratitude was owed. The Church taught that hunger was a form of penance, a way to mortify the flesh and remember Christ's suffering. Fasting was holy. Feasting, though permitted on certain days, carried the stain of excess. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, and the peasantry, despite their perpetual hunger, were not exempt from its condemnation. Preachers railed against overeating, against the sin of taking more than one's share. But the warnings were internalized. To appear greedy at a shared meal was to invite scorn. Portions were divided with care. The eldest ate first. Children received less. Visitors, even unexpected ones, were offered food, a social obligation that could not be refused without shame. Table manners, such as they were, reflected a communal approach to eating. Forks did not exist. Knives were personal tools, carried at the belt, used to cut meat and bread. Spoons were shared or food was scooped with hands. Trenchers served as plates, and when the meal was done, they were eaten or tossed to the dogs. Fingers were licked clean, greasy hands were wiped on clothing or on shared towels hung near the table. Belching was natural, a sign that the stomach was full. To suppress it would have seemed strange. Drink accompanied every meal, and drunkenness was common though not celebrated. Ale, consumed in quantity throughout the day, produced a mild, steady inebriation that dulled the edges of hunger and cold. Stronger ale, reserved for evenings and feast days, brought on louder talk, arguments, occasional brawls. Taverns and alehouses were sites of both comfort and trouble. Men gathered to drink, to complain, to trade news. Women brewed and served. The Church disapproved of excessive drinking, but acknowledged its inevitability. Drunkenness was a sin, yet ale was necessary. The contradiction went unresolved. The smell of damp stone fills the space around you, cool and faintly mineral. Your hands rest in your lap, rough and tired. Hold it. Breathe out slowly. The stone does not judge. Beliefs about food extended beyond prayer and moderation. Certain foods were thought to carry moral or physical qualities. Hot foods, though spiced or roasted, were believed to heat the blood and provoke lust. Cold foods, such as lettuce and cucumbers, cooled the passions and were recommended for monks and those seeking chastity. The theory of humors dictated that each person's body was governed by a balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Food, therefore, was not simply fuel but medicine. Eating the wrong thing at the wrong time could cause illness, disrupt the humors, invite disaster. Garlic and onions, though common in peasant cooking, were considered vulgar. They produced strong odors and were associated with the lower classes. The wealthy avoided them in favor of imported spices, pepper, ginger, cloves. These spices were not merely flavor enhancers but status symbols, proof of access to global trade. For peasants, the only spices were local herbs, foraged or grown in small gardens. Mustard seeds, ground into paste, provided sharpness. Salt, when available, was the only reliable seasoning. Bread itself carried religious significance. It was the body of Christ in the Eucharist, and even outside the church it retained a sacred quality. To waste bread was sinful. Crumbs were gathered and saved. Moldy loaves were scraped clean. Bread was never thrown away, never treated with disrespect. It was life, and life was not to be squandered. Seasonal foods were tied to the liturgical calendar. Pancakes were eaten on Shrove Tuesday, using up eggs and fat before the Lenten fast. Simnel cakes, rich with dried fruit and spices, were baked for Mothering Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Lent, a brief reprieve from deprivation. Easter brought the return of meat, eggs, and dairy, celebrated with roasted lamb if the household could afford it. Christmas was the grandest feast, though for many it meant only slightly more food than usual. The wealthy roasted geese, swans, and boars. The poor made do with extra bread and a bit of pork. You stand at the edge of the village green, watching. A woman is locked in the cucking stool, the wooden chair suspended over the pond. Her crime, selling ale that was too weak, watered down to stretch her profit. The bailiff operates the lever. The chair tips forward. She plunges into the water, gasping, arms flailing. The crowd murmurs but does not laugh. This is correction, not entertainment. She is pulled up, dripping, and dunked again, 3 times total. When it is finished, she is released, shivering, shamed. You turn away. Your own mother brews ale. She measures carefully, tests each batch, fears this exact fate. The regulation of food and drink was a communal concern, enforced by law and custom. Ale, the universal beverage, was subject to the assize of ale, a set of regulations that controlled price, quality, and measure. Alewives, the women who brewed and sold ale, were required to display a sign when their product was ready, usually an ale stake, a pole thrust through the thatch. Inspectors, appointed by the manor court, tested the ale by pouring it onto a wooden bench and sitting in the puddle wearing leather breeches. If the ale was too sugary, the leather would stick. This crude test determined whether the brew met standards. Those who failed were fined, publicly shamed, or subjected to the cucking stool. Bakers faced similar scrutiny. The assize of bread fixed the weight and price of loaves according to the cost of grain. A baker who sold underweight bread was punished. In some towns, he was dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf tied around his neck. In others, he was placed in the pillory, hands and head locked in wooden stocks, exposed to public ridicule and pelted with rotten food. The message was clear. To cheat on bread or ale, the staples of life, was to betray the community. Food theft carried severe penalties. Stealing livestock meant death by hanging. Taking grain from a field or a storehouse was a felony. Poaching game from a lord's land, even a rabbit or a pigeon, was prosecuted harshly. The forests were the king's, and their animals belonged to him. Peasants could not hunt deer, boar, or wildfowl without permission. Those caught with venison were whipped, branded, or imprisoned. The laws protected the privileges of the nobility and ensured that hunger, no matter how desperate, did not justify theft. Waste was a different kind of transgression. To throw away edible food was sinful, impractical, and socially condemned. Scraps went to animals. Bones were boiled for broth. Stale bread became trenchers or pottage thickener. Spoiled milk was fed to pigs. The only true waste was what could not be repurposed, and even then it was composted, returned to the soil. Efficiency was not a virtue but a necessity. The quiet weight of fatigue settles over you like a cloak. Somewhere, a murmur of distant voices rises and fades. Your breath slows. Rest here, in this pause. Medical knowledge intersected with food in ways both practical and absurd. The humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greece and codified by Galen, taught that health depended on balancing four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with qualities of heat, cold, dryness, and moisture. Food, therefore, was prescribed or forbidden based on its supposed effect on these humors. A person suffering from a cold, phlegmatic condition was advised to eat hot, dry foods, roasted meat, wine, spices. Someone with a hot, choleric temperament was told to consume cold, moist foods, fish, barley water, lettuce. This system created a complex web of dietary recommendations that often contradicted common sense. Fresh fruit, now considered healthy, was thought dangerous. It was cold and moist, prone to rotting in the stomach and producing noxious vapors. Apples were slightly more acceptable if cooked. Strawberries and cherries were suspect. Melons, introduced later in the period, were especially feared. Medical texts warned that they could cause fever, diarrhea, and death. The wealthy, who could afford such luxuries, often ate them anyway and blamed their subsequent illnesses on bad air. Physicians, available only to the rich, prescribed specific diets for ailments. Bloodletting, the removal of excess blood, was often accompanied by dietary restrictions. A patient recovering from being bled was told to avoid red meat, wine, and anything that might regenerate blood too quickly. For digestive complaints, physicians recommended bland pottages, weak broths, and stale bread. Constipation was treated with prunes, figs, and bran. Diarrhea called for binding foods, hard cheese, toasted bread, quince paste. Peasants, lacking access to physicians, relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. Honey soothed coughs. Garlic was chewed to ward off plague. Nettles, despite their sting, were boiled into teas for joint pain. Chamomile calmed the stomach. These remedies were not based on humoral theory, but on observation and tradition. They worked, or they did not, and the knowledge persisted because enough people survived to tell the tale. Poisoning, accidental and intentional, was a real concern. Ergot, a fungus that infected rye, caused convulsions, hallucinations, and death. Entire villages were afflicted during years when wet weather promoted its growth. The symptoms, gangrenous limbs and visions, were terrifying and inexplicable. Belladonna, growing wild, was sometimes mistaken for edible berries. Hemlock resembled parsley. Mushrooms were particularly dangerous, with no reliable way to distinguish safe varieties from deadly ones. Most peasants avoided mushrooms entirely, a cautious choice that saved lives. You kneel beside the stream, scrubbing a wooden bowl with sand and cold water. Your hands are numb, reddened from the chill. The bowl held yesterday's pottage, and a film of grease clings to its interior. You scrub harder, using a handful of rushes as a brush. The grease loosens, swirls away in the current. You rinse the bowl twice, shake it, and tuck it under your arm. Nearby, another woman washes clothing, pounding a woolen tunic against a flat rock. She does not look up. You both know the work is endless. The cycle does not stop. You walk back toward the cottage, feet squelching in mud, the bowl still damp against your ribs. The labor of food preparation consumed vast portions of each day. Grain had to be ground, a task performed by hand with quernstones or for those who could afford the fee, at the Lord's mill. Grinding by hand was backbreaking. 2 round stones, one atop the other, were rotated against each other while grain was fed through a hole in the center. The flour that emerged was coarse, flecked with stone dust, and required sieving through cloth to remove the largest fragments. A single day's flour took hours to produce. The mill, powered by water or wind, was faster but came with a cost. Peasants were obligated to use the Lord's mill and pay a portion of their flour as a fee. Some risked punishment by grinding at home in secret. Fetching water was another daily burden. Wells, when available, were communal. Women and children carried wooden pails or leather buckets, often walking considerable distances. Rivers and streams provided water for washing and, in desperation, drinking. But these sources were contaminated by upstream refuse, animal waste, and the runoff from tanning and dyeing operations. Boiling water for cooking rendered it safer, but drinking water was always a gamble. Ale, despite its low alcohol content, remained the safer choice. Firewood required gathering, chopping, and stacking. Dead branches were collected from commons and forests, dragged home and broken into manageable pieces. Green wood, cut from living trees, required drying before it could burn efficiently. The work was constant. A household's fire consumed wood at an astonishing rate, especially in winter. Running out of fuel meant cold meals, cold nights, and the grim task of begging neighbors for coals to restart the hearth. Cooking itself was a process of vigilance. Pots had to be stirred to prevent scorching. Bread dough, mixed the night before, had to be kneaded, shaped, and watched as it baked. Timing was judged by experience, not measurement. A loaf was done when it sounded hollow when tapped, when the crust had darkened to the right shade. Meat, when available, had to be turned regularly over the fire. Neglect meant burning, and burnt food was food wasted. The damp creeps into your bones, slow and insistent. Somewhere above, rain begins to fall, soft and steady. Though you are sheltered now, let the sound wash over you. Breathe. Seasonality dictated not only what was eaten, but how time itself was experienced. The agricultural calendar was a cycle of labor, rest, scarcity, and brief abundance. Planting season in spring demanded long hours in the fields, sowing barley, oats, peas. The diet during this period was meager, the previous year's stores nearly exhausted. Summer brought weeding, tending, and the first harvests of peas and beans. By late summer, grain fields ripened and the true work began. Harvest was a communal effort. Entire villages turned out to cut, bundle, and thresh grain before weather could destroy it. Men swung scythes from dawn until dusk. Women and children followed, gathering sheaves, binding them, stacking them in carts. The sun beat down, dust filled the air. Hands blistered, backs ached. Meals during harvest were larger, provided by the Lord or shared among laborers, but the exhaustion was unrelenting. A bad harvest meant hunger for the entire year ahead. A good harvest meant survival, nothing more. Autumn brought slaughter. Livestock that could not be fed through winter were killed. Pigs primarily, but also older sheep and cattle. The meat was butchered, salted, smoked, and stored. Blood was collected and mixed with oats to make blood pudding. Intestines were scraped, turned inside out, and used as sausage casings. Fat was rendered into lard, poured into crocks, and sealed with cloth. The work was messy, skilled, and essential. A family that failed to preserve its meat properly faced slow starvation. Winter was endurance. The days shortened. Cold seeped into every corner. The diet narrowed to its barest essentials. Bread, pottage, ale, occasionally a bit of cheese or salted fish. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing, insistent. Children grew thin, the elderly weakened. Illness spread more easily. Coughs turned into fevers, fevers turned into death. By February, the stores were dangerously low. The next planting season felt impossibly distant. Spring, when it finally arrived, brought hope and desperation in equal measure. The first wild greens appeared, and people rushed to gather them. Nettles, dandelion leaves, sorrel, all were boiled and eaten with gratitude. But the gap between the last of winter's stores and the first harvests of summer was treacherous. This period, called the Hungry Gap, saw the most deaths. Those who survived did so through luck, hoarded resources, or the charity of neighbors. You sit in the alehouse, a low-ceilinged room thick with smoke and the smell of bodies. The ale is weak, sour, but you paid a halfpenny for it, and you will drink it. Around you, men argue about the price of wool, the state of the roads, the weather. A woman moves between tables, refilling cups from a pitcher. She is the alewife, her apron stained, her face tired. You watch her pour. She does not smile. This is her living, her license granted by the manor court, her income taxed and monitored. One complaint, one bad batch, and she loses everything. You drink. The ale tastes of old grain and resignation. Social life, such as it was, revolved around shared meals and communal drinking. Ale houses served as gathering places, sites of news exchange, gossip, and occasional violence. They were not welcoming establishments in the modern sense. The rooms were small, poorly lit, furnished with rough benches and scarred tables. The ale was the draw, and the company, however coarse, provided relief from isolation. Men came to complain, to boast, to escape their homes for an hour. Women came less often, unless they were the brewers or servers themselves. The act of eating in public carried its own set of rules. To accept food from another's table was to acknowledge a relationship, a debt. To refuse food when offered was an insult. Hospitality, even among the poor, was a sacred obligation. A traveler passing through a village could expect to be fed, however meager the portion. To turn away a stranger without offering at least bread and ale was to invite divine displeasure. The Church reinforced this duty, citing scripture and the example of saints who fed the hungry. Yet charity had limits. Beggars, the truly destitute, were viewed with suspicion. Some were deserving, the crippled, the aged, the widowed. These might receive scraps, a crust of bread, a cup of ale. Others were considered idle, unwilling to work, and therefore unworthy. The distinction was enforced by parish officials, who licensed begging and punished those who sought alms without permission. A beggar caught outside his designated parish could be whipped and sent back. The system was cruel, but reflected a society operating on razor-thin margins. There was barely enough for those who labored. There was nothing for those who did not. Feast days disrupted the rhythm of scarcity, but only slightly. Christmas, Easter, Whitsun, and the various saints' days provided occasions for slightly larger meals, often funded by the church or the manor. A roasted goose, a bowl of frumenty made with wheat and milk, a spiced ale. These were luxuries that appeared once or twice a year. The anticipation of such feasts sustained people through months of monotony. The memory of them was savored long after the meal ended. But even feasts had their hierarchies. At a manor feast, the lord and his family ate at the high table, served first, given the best cuts of meat. The steward, the bailiff, and other officials ate next. Laborers and tenants ate last, receiving what remained. The quality of the food decreased as one moved down the social ladder. The lord ate white bread, manche, made from finely sifted wheat flour. The peasants ate maslin or rye. The lord drank wine, imported and spiced. The peasants drank ale. Even in celebration, inequality was reinforced. The heat of too many bodies in a small space presses against your skin. The air is stale, thick with breath and smoke. Your eyelids grow heavy. Let them close. The voices fade to a low murmur, distant and unimportant. Eating meat on Friday or during Lent was a mortal sin, punishable by penance and, in theory, damnation. The Church maintained that fish was acceptable because it was cold-blooded, and therefore did not count as flesh. This distinction seemed arbitrary, but it was enforced with vigor. Manor courts fined those caught eating meat on forbidden days. Neighbors reported one another. The fear of sin was genuine, and it shaped behavior. Blood was another site of taboo. While blood pudding was eaten, the consumption of raw blood was forbidden. It was associated with paganism, with the Jews, with dangerous foreignness. Animals had to be slaughtered properly, their throats cut, their blood drained. Meat from animals that died naturally or were found dead was considered unclean. To eat it was to risk disease and moral contamination. The carcass was left for scavengers or buried. Cannibalism, though vanishingly rare, haunted the collective imagination. Stories circulated of desperate times, sieges, famines so severe that people resorted to eating the dead. These tales were told as warnings, as evidence of humanity's capacity for degradation when hunger became absolute. The fear was not entirely unfounded. Famines did occur, and when they did, the social order collapsed. But for most, cannibalism remained a nightmare, not a reality. The consumption of certain animals was forbidden by custom, if not by law. Horses, though eaten in times of desperation, were considered improper. They were working animals, partners in labor, and to slaughter one for food was a sign of utter poverty. Dogs and cats were similarly off-limits. Those starving villagers occasionally killed them in secret. Swans belonged to the crown. To kill one was poaching, punishable by harsh penalties. Even in hunger there were lines that could not be crossed without consequence. The shame of poverty was often visible in what one ate. To subsist entirely on barley bread and pottage marked you as poor. To lack meat, cheese, or butter was to occupy the lowest rung. Wealthier peasants, those with larger landholdings or successful trades, ate better. They had pork more often, cheese in their larders, white bread on occasion. The gradations were subtle but significant. Status was legible in the contents of your bowl. You walk the road to market 3 miles from your village to the nearest town. The path is rutted, churned to mud by cartwheels and livestock. Your feet are wrapped in rags inside wooden clogs, but the cold still finds its way through. You carry a basket on your hip, 6 eggs carefully nested in straw, and a small wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth. These you will sell or barter for salt or needles or a length of coarse linen. The road is not empty. Others walk ahead and behind, their breath visible in the morning air. No one speaks. A cart passes, pulled by an ox, and you step aside into the ditch to let it go. Your clogs sink into the muck. You climb back onto the road and continue. 3 miles. It will take most of the morning. Travel for the average Tudor peasant was limited and arduous. Most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace. Journeys were undertaken only out of necessity, to market, to the manor court, to church on holy days, to visit family in neighboring villages. The roads were appalling. Maintained sporadically by forced labor, they degraded quickly under rain and traffic. In summer, they hardened into deep ruts that could snap a cart axle. Bridges were rare, rivers were forded on foot or crossed by ferry when one existed. Walking was the primary mode of transport. A peasant might walk 10 or 15 miles in a day if the need was urgent, but such distances were exhausting. Shoes, when owned, were simple leather or wooden clogs. Many went barefoot in warm months, saving their footwear for winter. The landscape itself was hostile: thorns, stones, uneven ground. A twisted ankle could mean days of lost labor, a serious injury in a world without effective medicine. Carts and wagons pulled by oxen or horses were used to transport goods but were expensive to own and maintain. Most peasants did not have them. When heavy loads needed moving, grain after harvest or firewood from the forest, neighbors pooled resources or rented a cart from someone better off. The vehicle itself was crude, wooden wheels, no suspension, liable to break under strain. Repairs required a wheelwright, another expense. Markets were the primary reason for travel beyond the immediate vicinity. Held weekly or bi-weekly in larger towns, they drew people from surrounding villages. The market square was a chaotic space: stalls selling bread, fish, cloth, pottery, tools. Animals penned and traded. Crowds jostling, thieves working the edges. Prices were negotiated, shouted, argued over. A peasant selling eggs or cheese stood in the cold for hours, hoping to make back enough to justify the journey. Competition was fierce. If your goods did not sell, you carried them home and tried again the next week. The cold bites at your exposed skin sharp and relentless. Your fingers ache where they grip the basket. Somewhere, the faint smell of wood smoke drifts past, a reminder of hearths and warmth you are not near. Breathe slowly. The cold does not own you. Pilgrimages represented a different kind of travel, religiously motivated and far more ambitious. Shrines to saints, holy wells and relics drew pilgrims from across England and beyond. Canterbury, with the tomb of Thomas Becket, was the most famous destination, but there were dozens of lesser sites, each promising miracles, healing, or the forgiveness of sins. For the devout or the desperate, pilgrimage was worth the risk and hardship. The journey to a shrine could take weeks. Pilgrims traveled in groups for safety, carrying minimal provisions and relying on monasteries, churches, and charitable households for food and shelter. They wore badges sewn to their hats or clothing to mark their purpose and gain assistance. The roads were dangerous. Bandits preyed on travelers. Illness struck without warning. Many pilgrims never returned home. Yet the act of pilgrimage was seen as spiritually beneficial, even salvific. To walk in discomfort, to suffer heat, cold, hunger, was to participate in Christ's suffering. The physical hardship was the point. Those who completed their pilgrimage brought back stories, relics, and a sense of accomplishment. For the poor, it was often the only journey of their lives, a brief escape from the monotony of the village. The weather dictated everything. A wet summer ruined grain in the fields, causing mildew and rot. A dry spring delayed planting. Frost in late May killed young crops. Flooding destroyed homes, drowned livestock, washed away bridges. Drought dried up wells and streams. There was no insurance, no government aid. A bad season meant hunger. A series of bad seasons meant famine. The landscape itself was unforgiving. Forests, though essential for fuel and forage, were dark, tangled, and home to wolves. Marshes bred disease-carrying insects. Rivers flooded unpredictably. The open fields, where most peasants labored, offered no shelter from sun or rain. Heat exhaustion in summer, frostbite in winter, both were occupational hazards. The body was a tool, and tools wore out. Winters were particularly brutal. Homes, poorly insulated and draughty, retained little heat. The fire provided warmth only to those directly beside it. Clothing was layered, linen undergarments, woolen tunics, cloaks, but wool, when wet, lost its insulating properties. Chilblains, painful swelling of the fingers and toes, afflicted nearly everyone. The old and the very young suffered most. Hypothermia, though not understood as such, killed quietly. You stand at the church door on Sunday, waiting. The service has ended, and the congregation files out slowly, blinking in the pale sunlight. You watch as the miller's wife passes, her gown dyed a respectable brown, her sleeves clean. She nods to the blacksmith. She does not nod to you. Your own tunic is patched at the shoulder, stained at the hem. Everyone knows your family ate nothing but pottage for a month last winter. Everyone knows your father sold his second pig to pay the rent. Poverty is not private. It is worn, visible, catalogued by neighbors who measure each other's fortunes with cold precision. You lower your eyes and step aside. The miller's wife continues past without acknowledging your existence. Reputation in a Tudor village was inseparable from what and how one ate. A household that could offer meat to guests, that kept ale on hand, that baked white bread even occasionally, earned respect. A household that could not, that scraped by on barley and turnips, occupied a lower social position. Invitations were extended or withheld, marriages were arranged or discouraged. A family's standing depended as much on their visible prosperity as on their labor or lineage. Generosity was expected but carefully measured. To refuse to share food when you had it was to mark yourself as selfish, unchristian, unworthy of reciprocity. But to give too freely was to risk your own survival. The balance was delicate. A woman who sent a loaf to a sick neighbor gained goodwill. A woman who gave away so much that her own children went hungry was considered foolish. The community watched, remembered, and adjusted its opinion accordingly. Gossip circulated with particular speed around food. A family caught eating meat on Friday faced weeks of sideways glances and muttered accusations. A man who hoarded grain during a bad harvest while others starved became a pariah. An alewife who watered her ale too much lost customers even if she escaped official punishment. Reputation was fragile, built over years and destroyed in moments. Feasts and communal meals were opportunities for display and judgment. At harvest festivals, families contributed what they could: a loaf, a cheese, a jar of preserved fruit. The quality and quantity of these contributions were noted. A generous offering enhanced status. A meager one confirmed poverty. No one stated this explicitly, but the knowledge was universal. Social hierarchy was performed and reinforced at every shared table. The scent of tallow candles, faint and greasy, drifts through the air. Your shoulders sag under the weight of the day. Let the tension drain from your jaw, your neck. Breathe in, hold, release. Children grew up understanding these dynamics. They learned to eat in a prescribed order: father first, then older sons, then mother and daughters, then the youngest. They learned not to ask for more when there was none. They learned to chew slowly, to make the portion last, to suppress the gnawing complaint of an empty stomach. Hunger was a teacher, and its lessons were absorbed early. Boys and girls were fed differently, though not always equally. Sons, especially those who would inherit land or take over trades, were prioritized. They received larger portions, more protein when it was available. Daughters destined for marriage or service were given less. The logic was economic. A strong son could work the fields, support aging parents, continue the family line. A daughter would leave, become another household's responsibility. The calculation was brutal but rarely questioned. Elderly parents posed a difficult problem. In theory, children were obligated to care for their aging mothers and fathers, to provide food and shelter. In practice, resources were finite. An old man who could no longer work became a burden. An old woman who consumed food without producing it strained the household. Some families managed, others did not. The elderly ate last, received the smallest portions, and knew their presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The process of aging was accelerated by diet and labor. A life of hard work, insufficient nutrition, and constant exposure to the elements wore bodies down quickly. By 40, a peasant was old. Teeth, ground down by gritty bread and poor hygiene, were broken or missing. Joints ached from decades of bending, lifting, hauling. Hearing failed. The body, pushed past its limits year after year, simply gave out. Malnutrition compounded every illness. A cough that might have resolved with rest and good food became pneumonia. A minor infection with no reserves to fight it turned septic. Wounds healed slowly, if at all. Women, weakened by repeated pregnancies and insufficient nutrition, died in childbirth at alarming rates. Men, their bodies depleted by fieldwork, succumbed to fevers, accidents, hernias that could not be repaired. The diet itself contributed to specific ailments. Scurvy caused by lack of vitamin C was common in late winter when fresh food disappeared entirely. Gums bled, teeth loosened, old wounds reopened. Rickets from insufficient sunlight and poor diet twisted children's bones. These conditions had no names, no understood causes, and no cures. They were simply part of life. You lie on your pallet at night, the straw beneath you compressed and musty. Your stomach is not full, but it is not entirely empty either. You had bread tonight, and pottage, and a cup of ale. This is not abundance, but it is survival. You think of your grandmother, dead 3 winters past, who ate less and less in her final months so the children could have more. You think of your own children asleep beside you, their breathing soft and steady. You wonder if they will remember you this way, lying here in the dark, or if memory, like bread, will harden and fade with time. Death, when it came, was rarely dramatic. The old simply stopped eating or could not eat, their bodies shutting down by degrees. Swallowing became difficult. Food lost its appeal. Families watched, helpless, as parents or grandparents declined. There was no medical intervention, no surgery, no antibiotics. The priest was called. Last rites were administered. The body was wrapped in a shroud, usually the person's own bedsheet, and buried in the churchyard within a day or two. Funerals were communal events, but not elaborate. The body was carried to the church on a bier, a simple wooden frame. The grave was dug by neighbors, and the body lowered. There were no coffins for the poor, just earth. A wooden marker, if the family could afford one, identified the spot. Within a generation, most graves were forgotten. The markers rotted away. The memory of the dead absorbed into the collective anonymity of the parish dead. Legacy, for a Tudor peasant, was not about monuments or written records. It was the continuation of the family line, the passing of skills and knowledge, the survival of children into adulthood. A man who lived to see his sons take over the landholding, who trained them in ploughing and planting, had achieved success. A woman who taught her daughters to brew, to bake, to manage a household, had fulfilled her role. Beyond this, there was little. Most left nothing behind. No letters, no diaries, no portraits. Their names appeared in manor court rolls, tax records, parish registers, brief entries marking birth, marriage, death. The details of their lives, their struggles, their small triumphs vanished. They were numbers in a ledger, bodies in the ground, memories that faded within a generation. Yet the system they participated in, the cycle of planting and harvest, of bread and ale, of hunger and brief plenty, continued. Each generation repeated the patterns of the last. Children grew up eating the same foods their parents ate, working the same fields, drinking from the same wells. Change was glacial, nearly imperceptible. A new crop might be introduced, a new tool adopted, but the fundamental realities remained unchanged for centuries. The mud clings to everything now, thick and cold. You can feel it in the air, the dampness that never quite leaves. Rest. Let the heaviness pull you down into stillness. The Tudor peasant diet, in its entirety, was a study in endurance. It was not designed to be pleasurable or varied. It was designed to keep people alive long enough to work, to reproduce, to raise the next generation of workers. Pleasure was incidental, rare, and quickly forgotten. The taste of roasted pork at a feast, the sweetness of honey on a holy day, these moments stood out precisely because they were exceptions. The repetition, the monotony, the constant low-grade hunger, all of it was normal. No one questioned it. No one expected better. The wealthy ate differently, everyone knew this, but the gap was understood to be divinely ordained. The Church taught that earthly suffering was temporary, that heaven awaited the righteous, that hunger and hardship were tests of faith. What other choice was there? And so they ate their bread, drank their ale, stirred their pottage, and endured. They watched their children go hungry in lean years and thanked God when the harvest was sufficient. They buried the ones who did not survive and moved forward because stopping was not an option. The rhythm of their days was dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of the land. Food was fuel, and fuel had to be acquired, prepared, and consumed, day after day, year after year, until the body gave out and someone else took your place at the table. The legacy of the Tudor peasant is not in what they ate, but in the fact that they survived it. That they woke each morning, worked until dark, ate what they could find or afford, and did it again the next day. That they passed on their knowledge, their resilience, their grim practicality to the next generation. That they endured a system designed to extract every ounce of labor while providing the bare minimum in return. And in the end, they left behind fields that still grow grain, wells that still draw water, and the faint, persistent echo of lives lived on the edge of survival, eating bread that tasted of stone and drinking ale that tasted of desperation, and calling it enough. You close your eyes. The day is done. Tomorrow will bring the same bread, the same pottage, the same quiet, grinding work. But tonight you rest, and in the morning you will rise and begin again. Sleep well.